we've been telling you yesterday about Japan's intent to ditch its place at the top, as in the dubious position of having the lowest age of consent among all G7 countries from 13 to 16. We're asking our very own I-24 News anchor and correspondent, Natasha Kirchuk, why now, and how do you really determine how old, what is old enough to say no, what is young enough to say yes? So, Natasha, let's start with the basics. Why now? What happened? And it's not just the age of consent. It's an overall overhaul.
Yes, there's a wider overhaul here. But I mean, just think about this. 13-year-olds are not allowed to legally drink or to drive or to vote in most countries. Yet until now, and this continues in Japan, you only have to be 13 years old to legally consent to sex. And that makes it so that, like you said, Japan has the lowest age of consent in the G7 in developed countries. And now Japan is finally proposing raising that age of consent. And this is really in response to criticism at the end of the day that the existing laws in Japan do not protect children from rape and other sexual abuse. Now, there were massive protests in Japan back in 2019. I'm sure you saw this on the news. It followed a string of acquittals of rapists, sexual assault. I mean, these are some really crazy stories that got people very upset. In Nagoya, one of the cases that triggered the most debate was a father who had been repeatedly raping his daughter, his teenage daughter, for years. And the court essentially said that she could have resisted if she wanted to. Again, the age of consent is 13 years old.
Yeah, and this law in Japan also stipulates that you need to prove that you are unable to resist. It's
right, exactly, and that's what needs to change here, right? Japanese law, like you said, there are two conditions that basically prove that a sexual assault has actually been committed. There has to be proof that the victim did not consent, and if you're 13 years old, again, questions arise here, and there must be proof that she or he was unable to actually resist physical violence or threats. So right now, we're going to be seeing a much wider overhaul. This is probably going to be passed in the summer. Basically, the definition of rape is going to be expanded to include intoxication, being drugged, being caught off guard. I'm not sure exactly what that means, and also, psychological control.
So just for the sake of it, give us a clue about the age of consent elsewhere in the world.
Yeah. So if we're looking at the G7, and obviously we have to compare to Israel. Here in Israel, the age of consent is 16, just like in most states in the United States. And also in the United Kingdom. In Greece and France, the age of consent is 15. In Germany and Italy, the age is actually 14, so pretty low.
So it's not that far-fetched. But I think that perhaps the most basic notions that we're not asking is, how do you determine the age of consent?
And that is what I have been asking myself, because again, the age of consent is basically the legal term for the age that a person must reach to agree to having sex. The problem is that there's no standard definition as to what makes you able to rationally make that decision. How developed does a person's brain need to be? Because we know that 13-year-olds have fairly good problem-solving skills, but they can't necessarily think about the future. They struggle to think about the consequences of their actions. And we know that the human brain doesn't fully develop into the mid-20s. So the question is, should the age of consent be determined on the age difference between two people? Does a 13-year-old truly have the knowledge or capacity to make a decision, given how we, teens are influenced by pressure, by new experiences? There are so many different factors that a child, a young teen, is much more susceptible to than your average adult. And then, of course, shouldn't an adult have the ability to figure out whether or not they are about to engage in sex with somebody who is of sound mind?
That's perhaps the bottom line here. The adult side of the equation should...
well, I mean, there's no clear answer to any of these questions, but the one thing that I would say is that it is time that Japan starts considering all of them.
No doubt about that. Natasha Kirchuk, I-24 News anchor and correspondent, thank you so very much for this, always bringing us, an extra insight into global affairs. Thank you so very much for this.